My son spent his college fund on paranormal equipment to map his dead friend's trauma signature. When I whispered, "You can't capture the past," he screamed, "I'm not trying to capture it, I'm collecting it. The echoes are already fading." I just stepped back. That was 9 months ago. This morning, he was found in the medical supply room, building a device to amplify residual frequencies. My 17-year-old son, Casimir, was recording his goodbye message to his girlfriend when the scaffolding collapsed at his school's construction site. By the time they pulled him from the debris, his best friend Theron was gone. After days in the ICU, doctors said Casimir would recover physically. But watching him replay that final video over and over, I knew something fundamental had shifted in his mind. The first few weeks blurred together with Casimir obsessively documenting everything. My husband would find him recording random conversations at 3 a.m., claiming he needed to capture the moments before they disappeared. I kept making his favorite meals, but he was too busy filming his food to eat it. He couldn't stop recording long enough to live. Our grief therapist said trauma could manifest in unusual ways, and Casimir needed time. So we didn't worry when he started interviewing everyone about their worst memories or filling notebooks with timestamps. We thought maybe this documentation was helping him process. On the day he returned to school, Casimir showed up with multiple recording devices, saying he needed to collect what happened there. An odd request, but my husband and I let it slide because what harm could some recordings do? A month later, Casimir walked through the door with equipment I'd never seen before. Electromagnetic field readers, infrared cameras, specialized microphones. He'd spent his entire college fund on them. I forced myself to stay calm, my heart breaking from the desperate sight. The next few days spiraled out of control. Casimir started approaching strangers who'd experienced trauma, claiming he could harvest their temporal residue. He recorded grieving people at funeral homes and accident sites. People started recognizing him as that weird kid with the cameras. My husband found him analyzing hundreds of hours of footage frame by frame. When he asked why, Casimir snapped, "I need to find the pattern." He started sleeping in his car to avoid confrontation. Things got worse when he dropped out of school, claiming it was interfering with his research. He spent every waking hour seeking out tragedy survivors instead. One morning I finally said, "Casimir, you can't capture the past." He screamed, "I'm not trying to capture it, I'm collecting it. The echoes are already fading." The certainty in his voice made me step back. "I'm worried about you," I whispered while he uploaded terabytes of recordings to encrypted drives. 2 weeks after my husband moved to his brother's, Casimir started acting strange. He'd leave for days and return with detailed maps marking high-yield locations. I found his journal filled with profiles of trauma survivors. Subject 47, House Fire 2019, strong electromagnetic signature, one entry read. At dinner, he excitedly told me about a woman at the hospital. "She lost 3 family members in 1 year, Casimir said, his eyes glittering. The readings around her were off the charts. The breaking point came when our doorbell rang at 2 a.m. A shaking man stood there with his teenage daughter, holding a stack of printed screenshots. The girl had survived a school shooting the previous year. "Your son's been stalking my daughter for weeks," the father said. Behind them, Casimir appeared from his car, still holding recording equipment. I wasn't ready for extraction yet, he hissed at me. The girl's mother showed me Casimir's messages, hundreds of requests to share her temporal fragments, detailed theories about how trauma creates measurable energy fields, offers to pay her for recorded sessions. Everything accelerated into a nightmare. The parents threatened legal action while Casimir insisted they were wasting precious resonance. He pulled out a device and aimed it at the girl, yelling, "Just let me record. It's already dissipating." "I mapped your trauma signature," Casimir shrieked. 3 more sessions and I could have isolated Theron's frequency. I was going to reconstruct his final moments. The girl sobbed while her parents called the police. I watched my surviving son completely break from reality. He started grabbing at the girl's belongings, claiming they held residual traces. "These objects absorbed your pain," Casimir wailed. Through tears, I watched him try to scan the terrified girl with multiple devices. "She's generating new trauma right now," the girl's mother screamed. "He's insane." I dialed 911 while Casimir ranted about temporal archaeology. Those minutes waiting for sirens felt like hours. When they finally arrived, they found Casimir calmly explaining his echo theory to the horrified family. "Traumatic events leave measurable imprints," he said reasonably. "Once I collect enough data, I can reconstruct anyone's final moments." The girl threw herself behind the officers while Casimir begged her to understand. "Don't you want to help preserve what happened to you?" Even as they guided him into the ambulance. The girl's family filed a restraining order, and Casimir's been hospitalized for 6 months now. Last time I visited, he whispered that his roommate Lysander had survived a plane crash. He smiled, mentioning the staff didn't check for recording devices during recreational activities. Then he asked if I could bring him some special batteries hidden inside a book. I stared at him through the reinforced glass window, my heart sinking. The special batteries request wasn't about recording devices at all. I'd learned enough about his patterns to recognize when he was testing me, seeing if I'd still enable his obsession. The drive home felt endless. 6 months of visits, 6 months of watching my brilliant son disappear deeper into his delusions. The psychiatrist had warned me that recovery would be slow, that trauma-induced psychosis could take years to fully treat. But hearing Casimir casually plan to exploit another patient's tragedy made my stomach turn. That evening, I sat at our empty dinner table, surrounded by photo albums. Pictures of Casimir and Theron at science camp building robots, winning academic competitions, 2 boys who'd planned to change the world together. Now one was gone, and the other was lost in a maze of his own making. My phone buzzed, a text from my husband asking about the visit. We'd been separated for 4 months now, the stress of Casimir's breakdown proving too much for our already strained marriage. I typed back a brief update, leaving out the part about Lysander. No need to worry him more. The next morning, I called Dr. Diaz at the psychiatric facility. She listened patiently as I explained about the batteries and Casimir's interest in his roommate. Her response was measured but concerning. Lysander had indeed survived a plane crash, losing his entire family. The staff had noticed Casimir spending increasing time with him during group activities. Dr. Diaz scheduled an emergency team meeting for that afternoon. I drove back to the facility, passing the exit for Casimir's old school. The construction site where Theron died had been completed months ago, a gleaming new science wing standing where scaffolding once collapsed. I wondered if Casimir knew, if it would help or hurt his recovery to see it. The meeting room smelled smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. Dr. Diaz sat across from me with 2 other staff members, their faces professionally neutral. They explained that Casimir had been making progress in individual therapy but struggled in group settings. His fixation on other patients' traumas was becoming disruptive. They showed me drawings from art therapy, elaborate diagrams of what Casimir called temporal mapping, with Lysander's name circled repeatedly, notes about extraction windows and resonance peaks. The therapist pointed out how the drawings had evolved from chaotic scribbles to methodical plans over recent weeks. I learned that Casimir had convinced 3 other patients to let him interview them about their traumas before staff intervened. He'd been trading commissary items for their stories, promising to preserve their pain before it aided. One patient, a young woman who'd lost her child, had complained that Casimir followed her constantly with questions. The social worker pulled out a thick folder. Inside were letters Casimir had tried to send out, all intercepted by staff. Dozens of requests to trauma survivor groups, offering to document their experiences. Detailed proposals for a temporal echo archive that would catalog human suffering. My son's handwriting, once so neat, had devolved into frantic scrawls. Dr. Diaz explained their new treatment plan. Casimir would be moved to a different unit, away from Lysander and other vulnerable patients. His privileges would be restricted further. No group activities where he could access other patients' stories. They were considering adjusting his medication again, though previous increases had only made him lethargic without addressing the core delusion. I signed the consent forms with shaking hands. Each signature felt like admitting my son might never come back to me, that the boy who'd built blanket forts and asked endless questions about the stars was gone forever. The staff assured me this was temporary, that with proper boundaries, Casimir could still improve. Their words rang hollow. On my way out, I passed the recreation room. Through the small window, I glimpsed Casimir sitting with a thin boy who must have been Lysander. They were playing chess, but I could see Casimir's lips moving constantly, his hands gesturing animatedly. Lysander looked uncomfortable, leaning away slightly. A staff member noticed and moved toward them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the girl Casimir had stalked, how terrified she'd been. Her parents had sent one message through their lawyer, asking if we were handling the situation. I'd assured them Casimir was getting treatment, that he couldn't hurt anyone else. But watching him target Lysander made me wonder if I was lying to myself. I wonder what's really going through Casimir's mind when he talks about temporal residue and echo theory. There's something oddly specific about how he describes these ideas that makes me curious about where they came. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. Forums for families dealing with psychosis, treatment options, success stories. Most were depressing. Parents describing years of cycling through medications, facilities, relapses. Some found stability, but the person who emerged was often fundamentally different from who they'd been before. One mother's post stood out. Her daughter had developed delusions after witnessing a murder, becoming convinced she could communicate with the dead through electronic devices. After 3 years of treatment, the daughter now lived independently, but still struggled with reality. The mother wrote, "I had to mourn the child I lost while learning to love the one who remained." The next week brought a call I'd been dreading. Casimir had somehow obtained a small digital recorder, likely traded from another patient. Staff found him in the bathroom at 3 a.m., trying to record Lysander sleeping. He'd been documenting the boy's breathing patterns, convinced they contained trauma frequencies from the plane crash. Lysander had requested a room change, terrified of my son's attention. The incident meant Casimir would face a review board that could extend his involuntary commitment. Dr. Diaz explained that his behavior showed he still posed a risk to others, even in a controlled environment. The board would meet in 2 weeks. I hired a patient advocate, a tired-looking woman named Ms. Chen, who'd seen too many broken families. She reviewed Casimir's file with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes. Her assessment was blunt. Without significant improvement, Casimir could remain institutionalized indefinitely. The stalking incident, even within the facility, demonstrated ongoing dangerous fixations. Ms. Chen suggested I write a statement for the board about Casimir's history, his life before the trauma. I spent days crafting it, trying to capture who my son had been. The boy who'd stayed up all night to help his friend study for a chemistry test, who'd volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend, who'd cried when his goldfish died and insisted on a proper burial in the backyard. The facility allowed me a supervised visit before the hearing. Casimir seemed subdued, the medication making him move slowly. He didn't mention Lysander or recordings. Instead, he talked about missing his father, about wanting to come home. For a moment, he sounded like himself again. Then he asked if I'd kept all his equipment safe, if the data was still preserved. I lied and said yes, watching his face relax. He started explaining his new theory about how trauma could be inherited, passed down through generations like genetic code. If he could just map enough family trauma histories, he could predict future events. The words tumbled out faster as the medication wore off, his eyes growing bright with manic energy. The guard signaled our time was up. As I stood to leave, Casimir grabbed my hand. His grip was desperate, his fingers cold. He whispered that Theron had appeared to him in dreams, that his friend was trying to send messages through the other patients. If he could just record enough of them, he could piece together what Theron needed to say. I pulled away gently, my heart breaking. In the hallway, I passed Lysander with his visitor, an elderly woman who must have been his grandmother. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and accusation. I wanted to apologize, to explain that my son hadn't always been this way. But what could I say that would matter? The review board met on a rainy Tuesday. I sat in the waiting room with Ms. Chen, watching other families come and go. Some left crying, others relieved. A father told his wife their daughter was being released. A young man learned his brother would stay another 6 months. Each decision represented a life in limbo, a family restructured around absence. When they called us in, I faced 5 professionals who would determine my son's immediate future. They asked about his support system, his behavior before the incident, my ability to manage him if released. I answered honestly, admitting I was terrified of him coming home, terrified of him staying locked away. The truth felt like betrayal and love mixed together. Dr. Diaz testified about Casimir's treatment resistance, his continued fixation on other patients. The incident with Lysander was described in clinical terms that somehow made it sound both better and worse than it was. They played audio from therapy sessions where Casimir explained his theories, his voice passionate and utterly convinced. He sounded brilliant and completely insane. The board asked if I had questions. I wanted to ask when my son would come back. track if the boy I raised still existed somewhere inside the stranger who stalked trauma survivors. Instead, I asked about treatment options, about new therapies that might help. They gave me pamphlets and sympathetic looks, but no real answers. The decision came by mail 3 days later. 6 more months of involuntary commitment with monthly reviews. Casimir would be transferred to a specialized unit for patients with fixed delusions. More intensive therapy, different medications, stricter supervision. The letter emphasized this was for his safety and the safety of others. I sat in my empty house holding the paper, feeling relief and guilt in equal measure. That weekend, I finally visited the completed science wing at Casimir's old school. A plaque by the entrance memorialized Theron and 2 construction workers who died in the collapse. Students moved past it without looking, the tragedy already fading into history. I wondered what Casimir would make of it, if he'd try to measure the temporal residue around the memorial. Inside, the hallways smelled like fresh paint and teenage anxiety. The principal had agreed to let me collect Casimir's belongings from his locker. I found textbooks covered in timestamps, notebooks filled with observations about his classmates' micro-expressions. Even before the collapse, he'd been documenting everything, as if some part of him knew tragedy was coming. At the bottom of the locker was a birthday card Theron had given him just weeks before the accident. Inside, his friend had written, "Here's to another year of trying to figure out how the universe works." I held it carefully, understanding why Casimir couldn't let go. His best friend had died mid-sentence, mid-discovery, mid-life. No wonder he was desperate to capture what remained. I kept the card but threw away the notebooks. Whatever answers Casimir was seeking wouldn't be found in the documented pain of strangers. On the drive home, I passed the hospital where that terrified girl had fled from my son. The restraining order meant he could never contact her again, even if he recovered. Another bridge burned in his desperate search for meaning. That evening, my husband called. He'd been seeing a therapist, trying to understand how we'd missed the signs. The guilt was eating at both of us. We talked for an hour about Casimir's childhood, looking for clues we'd overlooked. Had he always been too intense, too focused, or had Theron's death simply shattered something that was already fragile? We made plans to visit Casimir together next month. The therapist thought it might help, seeing us united despite the separation. I doubted Casimir would notice. His world had narrowed to frequencies and recordings, to the desperate belief that pain could be captured and preserved, but we would try anyway, because that's what parents do. As I prepared for bed, I found myself checking the locks twice, a new habit since Casimir's breakdown. Part of me feared he'd somehow escape, show up at the door with his equipment and theories. Another part wished he would, that I'd wake up to find this had all been a nightmare, that my son was just a grieving teenager who would eventually heal. The house felt too quiet without his constant recording, without the hum of his equipment. I'd packed it all away in the basement, boxes of expensive devices that had drained his college fund. Sometimes I thought about selling them, using the money for his treatment, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. They were all I had left of his passion, distorted as it had become. I lay in bed thinking about tomorrow's support group meeting. Other parents who understood the particular grief of losing a child who was still alive. We'd share updates and fears, celebrate small victories and mourn new setbacks. Someone would cry, someone would offer hope. We'd all pretend we weren't terrified of our own children. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. I wondered if somewhere another tragedy was unfolding, another family about to be shattered. Would there be a teenager there, recording it all, convinced they could preserve the pain? Or was that particular madness unique to my son, born from the specific alchemy of brilliance and trauma? The moonlight through my window reminded me of nights when Casimir was young, when he'd sneak into our room afraid of the dark. I'd hold him close and promise that monsters weren't real, that he was safe. Now he saw monsters everywhere, in the form of fading echoes and lost frequencies, and I couldn't protect him from the demons in his own mind. Tomorrow I would call Dr. Diaz again, ask about the new treatment plan. I would research more therapies, read more success stories, cling to any hope I could find. I would continue visiting my son, even when he looked through me like I was just another source of data to be collected, because underneath the delusions and obsessions, he was still my child. The boy who'd built blanket forts was gone. The teenager who'd filmed his goodbye to his girlfriend was gone too, buried under scaffolding and grief. What remained was someone I didn't recognize but couldn't abandon. My son had become a stranger, but he was still my son, and I would keep showing up, keep hoping, keep loving him through the glass that separated us. His mom checked the locks twice every night now. That detail really makes me wonder how fear changes our daily routines in such specific ways. What made her develop that exact habit instead of something else? Even if he never came back to me, even if the Casimir I raised was truly gone, I would bear witness to who he'd become. Not with recordings or equipment, but with the imperfect, persistent love of a mother who refused to let go. That was my own obsession, my own inability to accept loss. But unlike his, mine couldn't hurt anyone but myself. The clock showed 2 a.m., the same time those parents had stood on my doorstep with their terrified daughter. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about Lysander, alone in his new room, afraid of my son's attention. Tried not to imagine what other vulnerable people Casimir might fixate on next. Tried to find peace in the knowledge that, for now, he was contained. Sleep never came that night. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Casimir over the past months, searching for signs I'd missed. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on me like a physical presence, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The support group meeting that morning felt different. I sat in the circle of plastic chairs, listening to familiar stories of medication adjustments and facility transfers. When my turn came, I found myself describing the battery request, the way Casimir had smiled when mentioning Lysander. The other parents exchanged knowing looks. They understood the particular horror of watching your child become a predator. After the meeting, a woman named Victoria approached me in the parking lot. Her daughter had been in the same facility as Casimir last year before being transferred. She handed me a crumpled piece of paper with her number, explaining that her daughter had mentioned a patient who collected trauma stories. The description matched Casimir perfectly. I called Victoria that afternoon. She described how her daughter had initially felt sorry for Casimir, how he'd seemed so earnest about preserving people's experiences, but then he'd started following her to therapy sessions, pressing his ear against doors, trying to record her private conversations with doctors. He'd convinced another patient to steal her journal, promising to return it after he'd documented her entries about losing her brother. Victoria's warning chilled me. She explained how Casimir Casimir had developed a network within the facility, trading favors and manipulating vulnerable patients. He'd identified those desperate for connection and offered them understanding in exchange for their stories. Some patients had even started believing his theories, thinking their trauma could be preserved and studied. That evening, I received an unexpected call from the facility. A night nurse, not Dr. Diaz, spoke in hushed tones. She wasn't supposed to contact families directly, but felt I needed to know. Casimir had been found in the medical supply room at 4 a.m., attempting to construct something from stolen materials. When confronted, he'd claimed he was building a device to amplify trauma frequencies. The nurse described finding detailed blueprints hidden in Casimir's mattress, plans for what he called a temporal resonance amplifier that would supposedly capture the echo of traumatic events from objects and locations. He'd been stealing small electronic components during supervised activities, hiding them throughout his room. The sophistication of his plans suggested he'd been working on this for months. I drove to the facility immediately, despite visiting hours being long over. Dr. Diaz met me in the lobby, her professional composure cracking slightly. She led me to her office where she spread out Casimir's blueprints. The technical drawings were intricate, mixing real electrical engineering principles with delusional theories about temporal energy. Among the papers, I found lists of patients with detailed notes about their traumas. Casimir had been categorizing them by what he called resonance potential. Lysander topped the list, followed by a girl who'd witnessed her sister drown and an older man who'd survived a house fire. Each entry included strategies for gaining their trust and accessing their stories. Dr. Diaz revealed that Casimir had been more manipulative than they'd realized. He'd been using his intelligence to play different staff members against each other, telling each what they wanted to hear during sessions. He'd convinced one therapist he was improving while telling another he needed more freedom to process his grief. The inconsistencies had only recently been discovered during a staff review. The next morning brought worse news. Lysander had experienced a severe panic attack after Casimir cornered him in the library. Security footage showed Casimir blocking the exit while explaining his theories about extracting memories from trauma survivors. Lysander had collapsed, requiring medical intervention. His grandmother was threatening to contact authorities if Casimir wasn't kept away from her grandson. I spent hours in meetings with hospital administrators, discussing options. They proposed transferring Casimir to a maximum security psychiatric facility 3 hours away. The place specialized in patients with dangerous fixations. I toured it that afternoon, walking through sterile hallways with multiple locked doors. The patients there looked hollow, medicated into compliance. The thought of Casimir in such a place made me physically ill. Back home, I found myself going through Casimir's old room, searching for clues about when his obsession had truly begun. Hidden behind books, I discovered notebooks dating back 2 years, long before Theron's death. Pages filled with observations about classmates' micro-expressions during discussions of difficult topics. He'd been studying human pain even then, though it had seemed like typical teenage fascination with psychology. My husband arrived unexpectedly that evening. He'd driven down after hearing about the proposed transfer from Dr. Diaz. We sat at our kitchen table, the same place where we'd once helped Casimir with homework and science fair projects. Now we were signing papers to send him to a place that felt more like prison than hospital. He showed me emails from Casimir he'd been receiving at his brother's house. Long, rambling messages about temporal theory and the importance of preserving traumatic echoes. In one, Casimir had written about feeling Theron's presence in the facility, claiming his friend was trying to communicate through other patients' traumas. The emails grew increasingly frantic, begging his father to understand the importance of his work. We decided to visit Casimir together before the transfer. The meeting room felt smaller with both of us there. Casimir entered with 2 orderlies, his movements restricted by soft restraints after the incident with Lysander. His eyes lit up seeing us together, and for a moment he looked like our son again. The illusion shattered when he immediately launched into explaining his latest theories. He described how every traumatic event created ripples in what he called the temporal field. These ripples could be detected and recorded with the right equipment. He claimed Theron's death had opened his perception to these frequencies, making him uniquely qualified to study them. My husband tried reasoning with him, explaining how his behavior was hurting people. Casimir's response was chilling in its logic. He argued that temporary discomfort was worth preserving traumatic experiences for scientific study. He compared himself to early medical researchers who faced opposition before their discoveries were validated. The conviction in his voice made it clear he truly believed he was a misunderstood pioneer. During the visit, Casimir revealed he'd been corresponding with other patients through a complex system of notes hidden in library books. He'd created what he called the Trauma Preservation Society, convincing vulnerable patients that their pain had scientific value. The revelation prompted an immediate facility-wide investigation. Staff discovered an elaborate network of hidden messages throughout the facility. Casimir had recruited at least 6 other patients into his delusions. They'd been sharing their traumas in written form, believing they were contributing to important research. One young woman had documented her entire history of abuse at Casimir's request, thinking it would help prevent future tragedies. The investigation revealed that Casimir had been far more organized than anyone realized. He'd assigned roles to his recruited patients, having them gather information about new arrivals and their histories. He'd created a ranking system based on trauma severity and what he called temporal clarity. Patients competed for his approval by sharing increasingly personal details. Dr. Diaz called an emergency meeting with all families involved, the room filled with angry and frightened parents demanding answers. I sat among them, feeling the weight of their accusations. My son had re-traumatized their already fragile children. One father described finding his daughter writing detailed accounts of her worst memories, believing she was contributing to science. The facility implemented immediate changes. All books were removed from common areas pending inspection. Patients were separated during activities to prevent communication. Additional staff monitored interactions. The atmosphere shifted from therapeutic to punitive, all because of my son's manipulation. I hired a new psychiatrist for a second opinion, hoping for alternatives to the maximum security facility. Dr. Nicholas Reeves specialized in trauma-induced delusions. He spent 3 sessions with Casimir, emerging each time looking increasingly concerned. His assessment was thorough but disheartening. Dr. Reeves explained that Casimir's delusion had become his entire identity. Every aspect of his personality now revolved around his echo theory. reality. Traditional therapeutic approaches weren't working because Casimir had intellectualized his trauma into a complex theoretical framework. Something feels off about how quickly Casimir built this whole network, getting 6 patients to believe his theories and create this hidden message system. The staff must have been really distracted to miss all those library book drops and secret notes being passed around. He was too smart for his own good, using his intelligence to reinforce rather than challenge his delusions. The psychiatrist suggested an experimental treatment program at a research hospital. It combined intensive therapy with activities designed to redirect obsessive focus. The program had shown promise with highly intelligent patients whose delusions had scientific or technical themes. It was expensive and had a long waiting list, but it seemed more hopeful than warehousing Casimir in maximum security. I spent days calling in favors and liquidating savings to secure Casimir a spot in the program. The facility was 2 states away, meaning visits would be difficult, but the alternative was watching him disappear into an increasingly restrictive system. I filled out applications, gathered medical records, and wrote letters advocating for my son. Meanwhile, Casimir's behavior at the current facility escalated. He'd somehow obtained a small radio and had been disassembling it to build what he called a trauma frequency detector. When staff confiscated it, he became violent for the first time, throwing furniture and screaming about destroyed research. It took 4 orderlies to restrain him. The incident accelerated discussions about his transfer. Insurance companies got involved, questioning the necessity of specialized treatment. I spent hours on phone calls, arguing with representatives who'd never met my son, trying to convey the complexity of his condition. Each denial felt like another door closing on his future. My husband and I met with a financial advisor to explore options. We'd already drained Casimir's college fund on equipment. Now we were looking at second mortgages and retirement withdrawals. The advisor laid out stark numbers, showing how treatment costs could bankrupt us within 2 years. We stared at spreadsheets, trying to put a price on our son's sanity. During this chaos, I received a call from Lysander's grandmother. I expected anger, but her voice carried only sadness. She explained that Lysander had been making progress before encountering Casimir. Now he was having nightmares about being recorded, convinced someone was stealing his memories. She wasn't calling to blame, just to share the impact, mother to mother. The conversation haunted me. I thought about all the patients Casimir had affected, all the families dealing with setbacks because of his obsession. Each person he'd targeted was someone's child, already struggling with their own demons. My son had become a predator of the vulnerable, hunting their pain with scientific precision. I started attending a different support group, one specifically for families of patients with dangerous behaviors. The stories there were darker, filled with violence and victimization. Parents spoke about children who'd become unrecognizable, who'd hurt others in ways that couldn't be undone. I realized with growing dread that this was my future if Casimir didn't get proper treatment. One mother, Victoria, became an unexpected source of support. Her son had developed violent delusions after a head injury, believing he could absorb people's memories through touch. She'd spent 5 years navigating the system, learning which treatments worked and which warehoused patients. Her guidance proved invaluable as I fought for Casimir's placement in the research program. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Reeves had been corresponding with colleagues about Casimir's case, and a researcher in trauma-induced psychosis expressed interest. Dr. Sarah Chen ran a small program that studied the intersection of intelligence and delusion. She'd been looking for a patient with Casimir's specific presentation. I video called with Dr. Bailey, finding her approach refreshingly different. She didn't see Casimir as simply ill, but as someone whose brilliant mind had created an elaborate defense against unbearable loss. Her program focused on redirecting intellectual capacity rather than suppressing it. She spoke about teaching patients to use their intelligence against their delusions rather than in service of them. The program required a comprehensive evaluation. Casimir would need to demonstrate both the severity of his condition and his potential for recovery. Dr. Bailey warned that the evaluation process itself could be triggering, as it would require Casimir to confront the reality of his behavior. Many patients became violent when their delusions were challenged so directly. I prepared Casimir for the evaluation through careful visits. Without revealing the full purpose, I began asking questions about his theories, gently pointing out inconsistencies. His responses ranged from elaborate explanations to angry dismissals, but occasionally, I glimpsed moments of doubt, tiny cracks in his certainty that gave me hope. The evaluation took place over 3 days. Dr. Bailey and her team conducted extensive interviews, psychological tests, and observed behavioral patterns. They presented Casimir with scenarios designed to test his reasoning and empathy. I waited in a nearby hotel, too anxious to do anything but pace and check my phone. On the second day, Casimir attempted to manipulate the evaluation team. He tried to convince a junior researcher that the evaluation itself was generating valuable trauma data. When that failed, he accused them of suppressing important scientific discoveries. Dr. Bailey later told me his manipulation tactics were actually encouraging, showing he retained enough awareness to try different strategies. The final day involved family interviews. My husband and I spent hours detailing Casimir's history, from his early brilliance to his current state. We described the boy who'd built elaborate science projects and the young man who now saw human pain as data to be collected. The contrast seemed to intrigue Dr. Bailey's team. While awaiting results, I dealt with ongoing crises at Casimir's current facility. He'd convinced a new patient that recording her nightmares could prevent them from recurring. Staff found them in the recreation room at dawn, with Casimir instructing her to describe her dreams in detail while he took notes. The girl's parents were furious, threatening lawsuits. The facility director called a meeting to discuss immediate placement options. If the research program rejected Casimir, he would be transferred to maximum security within the week. They couldn't risk more incidents. I understood their position but felt trapped between protecting others and abandoning my son to a system that would only warehouse him. Dr. Bailey's decision arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The program had accepted Casimir, but with strict conditions. He would start in their most restrictive unit, earning privileges through demonstrated progress. Any attempt to manipulate other patients would result in immediate expulsion. The treatment would be intensive, combining medication, therapy, and cognitive restructuring techniques. I felt relief mixed with trepidation. The program offered hope, but no guarantees. Casimir would be even farther from home, in an unfamiliar environment with new people to potentially target, but it was better than watching him disappear into the maximum security system, medicated into a hollow shell of himself. Telling Casimir about the transfer proved challenging. He initially refused, claiming he was close to breakthrough discoveries at his current facility. When I mentioned the research aspect of the new program, his interest sparked. I carefully framed it as an opportunity to work with scientists who might understand his theories, hating myself for the manipulation, but seeing no alternative. The transfer required extensive coordination. Casimir would be transported by secure medical vehicle, accompanied by staff trained in managing potentially violent patients. His belongings would be searched, with any items that could be used to build devices confiscated. The new facility had learned from our experiences and wouldn't underestimate his resourcefulness. I spent Casimir's last week at the current facility gathering his possessions and completing paperwork. In his room, I found more evidence of his elaborate planning, detailed maps of the facility marked with patient room numbers and trauma types, charts tracking staff schedules and identifying those most likely to be sympathetic. My son had turned the hospital into his personal laboratory. Among his papers, I discovered something that stopped me cold. A letter addressed to Theron, written as if his friend were still alive. In it, Casimir promised to complete their work, to prove that death wasn't the end of consciousness, but a transformation into temporal echoes. He wrote about feeling Theron's presence in every trauma survivor, believing his friend was trying to communicate through their pain. The letter revealed the depth of Casimir's inability to process loss. He'd created an entire worldview where death could be reversed through sufficient data collection. Every trauma survivor he targeted was, in his mind, a potential channel to his dead friend. The realization helped me understand the desperation driving his behavior, even as it horrified me. My final visit before the transfer was supervised by Dr. Diaz and 2 orderlies. Casimir seemed subdued, perhaps sensing the impending change. He asked about the new facility, showing particular interest in their research capabilities. I answered carefully, emphasizing the treatment aspects while acknowledging the scientific approach. As the visit ended, Casimir grabbed my hand with surprising strength. His eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen in months as he whispered urgently about protecting his research. He begged me to ensure his notes and theories would be preserved, insisting future scientists would validate his work. I promised to keep everything safe, another lie added to the growing collection. The morning of the transfer arrived gray and drizzling. The way his mom found that letter to Theron makes my brain spin with questions. Does Casimir really believe his friend is somehow living inside other people's trauma? How does someone's mind create such a detailed system to avoid accepting death? Commentary ends here. I met the transport team at the facility, watching them prepare for the journey. Casimir emerged flanked by staff, wearing restraints that made him look like a criminal. His eyes darted around, possibly searching for escape routes or memorizing details for future use. I wasn't allowed to accompany him but could follow in my own car. The drive stretched endlessly, giving me too much time to think about everything that had led to this moment. Highway signs marked our progress toward an uncertain future, each mile taking my son farther from home but hopefully closer to healing. The new facility appeared through rain-streaked windows, a modern building that looked more like a research center than a hospital. Dr. Bailey met us in the lobby, her demeanor professional but warm. She explained the intake process while Casimir was led away for initial evaluation. I wouldn't see him again for 2 weeks while he adjusted to the program. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of emptiness. The house felt haunted by Casimir's absence, even though he'd been gone for months. I found myself organizing his old belongings, packing away remnants of the boy he'd been. His father visited more frequently, and we began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship around shared grief. Dr. Bailey called with regular updates. Casimir was testing boundaries, as expected. He'd attempted to convince other patients that the program was secretly studying their traumas, but the staff was prepared for such tactics. The structured environment and constant supervision limited his ability to manipulate others. Slowly, he was being forced to confront reality without escape into delusion. The first setback came when Casimir discovered another patient had lost someone in a building collapse. He became fixated, following the young man and insisting their experiences were connected. Staff intervened quickly, but Casimir's agitation required medication adjustment. Dr. Bailey assured me such setbacks were expected, part of the difficult process of breaking down delusional systems. I returned to my support groups, sharing updates and drawing strength from other parents' experiences. Some had children in the same program, offering insights about what to expect. They warned about the emotional toll of watching your child fight against help, the way intelligent patients could twist therapy into reinforcement of their delusions. A month into treatment, I received permission for a video call with Casimir. His appearance shocked me. The medication had added weight to his thin frame, and his eyes seemed dulled, but he spoke more coherently, discussing daily routines without mentioning temporal echoes or trauma frequencies. It was progress, even if it felt like talking to a sedated stranger. Dr. Bailey explained their approach during our monthly consultation. They were using Casimir's intelligence against his delusion, teaching him to apply scientific skepticism to his own theories. He was learning to identify logical fallacies in his thinking, to demand evidence for his beliefs. The process was slow and met with resistance, but small cracks were appearing in his certainty. The program also addressed the underlying trauma of losing Theron. Through carefully structured therapy, Casimir was beginning to process his grief without transforming it into elaborate theories. He still insisted his ideas had merit, but could occasionally acknowledge that his methods of pursuing them had been harmful. 3 months in, Casimir experienced what Dr. Bailey called a breakthrough moment. During group therapy, another patient confronted him about the impact of his behavior. Instead of deflecting with theories, Casimir had broken down crying, expressing remorse for the first time. It was a small step but significant, showing he could connect with others' pain without trying to collect it. The financial strain of treatment grew heavier. Insurance covered partial costs, but the specialized program required significant out-of-pocket expenses. My husband and I sold unnecessary possessions, took on extra work, and accepted help from family members who could afford it. Each payment felt like an investment in reclaiming our son from his delusions. I visited in person for the first time after 4 months. The facility's visiting room was bright and welcoming, designed to feel less institutional. Casimir entered without restraints, moving with the careful gait of someone heavily medicated but stable. His greeting was warm but formal, as if he were meeting a distant relative. Our conversation revealed both progress and persistent challenges. Casimir could discuss his theories more abstractly, abstractly, acknowledging them as coping mechanisms rather than scientific facts. But when I mentioned Theron directly, his eyes took on the familiar fervent gleam. The core delusion remained, even as its edges softened under treatment. Dr. Bailey joined us briefly, observing our interaction. Later, she explained that Casimir was in a delicate phase where pushing too hard could cause regression. They were building his capacity for reality testing while carefully supporting his fragile emotional state. The goal wasn't to erase his intelligence or creativity, but to redirect it toward healthier pursuits. The visit ended with Casimir showing me artwork from therapy, abstract paintings that supposedly represented temporal frequencies, but looked more like expressions of grief and confusion. I praised them enthusiastically, seeing them as progress from building devices and stalking trauma survivors. Any creative outlet that didn't involve victimizing others was worth encouraging. Driving home, I reflected on the long journey ahead. Casimir might never fully abandon his beliefs about temporal echoes and trauma preservation, but if treatment could help him function without hurting others, if he could find meaning beyond collecting pain, that would be enough. I'd learned to measure success in smaller increments, celebrating days without incidents rather than hoping for complete cure. The house felt different now, less haunted by what was lost and more hopeful about what might be recovered. I began converting Casimir's old room into a space for when he could visit, removing reminders of his obsession while preserving elements of who he'd been before. It was an act of faith that someday he'd come home, changed, but still my son. My husband moved back gradually, first staying weekends, then returning fully. We attended couples counseling, working through the trauma of watching our child transform into someone unrecognizable. The therapist helped us see that we'd both been grieving not just Theron's death, but the loss of the son we'd known. Together, we began building a foundation for whatever family we'd become. Support group meetings became less about crisis management and more about long-term planning. Other parents shared stories of children who'd stabilized after years of treatment, who'd found ways to live with their altered perceptions of reality. Some worked simple jobs, others lived in supervised housing, but they were present in the world rather than lost to delusion. 6 months into the program, Casimir faced his biggest test. A new patient arrived who'd survived a building collapse similar to Theron's accident. The staff watched carefully as Casimir interacted with him during group activities. Instead of pursuing his trauma, Casimir offered genuine support, sharing his own loss without trying to extract data or recordings. Dr. Bailey called it a pivotal moment. Casimir had chosen empathy over obsession, connection over collection. He still mentioned temporal theories occasionally, but they'd become philosophical musings rather than driving compulsions. The medication and therapy were creating space between thought and action, allowing him to have ideas without being controlled by them. The next morning brought an emergency call from Dr. Bailey. Casimir had orchestrated something during the night shift. I drove through pre-dawn darkness, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The facility's parking lot blazed with security lights as staff members rushed between buildings. Dr. Bailey met me in the lobby, her usual composure replaced by visible concern. She led me to a conference room where security monitors displayed footage from the previous night. Casimir had somehow convinced 3 patients to create a distraction in the common area while he accessed the administrative offices. The night staff, overwhelmed by the coordinated chaos, hadn't noticed him slip away for nearly 20 minutes. The security footage showed Casimir at a computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He'd used a staff member's login credentials, obtained through weeks of careful observation and social engineering. Dr. Bailey explained he'd accessed patient files, downloading trauma histories, and contact information for dozens of residents. The data breach was significant, potentially affecting every vulnerable person in the facility. I watched my son work with terrifying efficiency, his movements practiced and deliberate. He'd clearly planned this for months, studying staff patterns, identifying security weaknesses, recruiting accomplices. The brilliant boy who'd once built robots for science fairs had turned his intelligence toward violating others' privacy on a massive scale. Dr. Bailey revealed more disturbing details. Casimir had created hidden caches throughout the facility containing handwritten copies of patient information. He'd been transcribing trauma stories during art therapy, disguising them as abstract poetry. Staff found notebooks hidden in ceiling tiles, behind radiators, inside hollowed-out books. The scope of his data collection dwarfed anything from his previous facility. The other patients involved in the distraction faced immediate consequences. 2 were transferred to more restrictive units, while the third, a young woman who'd lost her family in a fire, broke down completely. Why did the staff give him access to art supplies and books without checking them more carefully? Casimir spent months watching their routines and they never noticed. That seems strange for a place that's supposed to specialize in patients like him. She'd believed Casimir's promises that documenting her trauma would give it meaning. Instead, she'd enabled him to violate dozens of people's privacy. I spent hours in meetings with facility administrators and their legal team. The data breach required notification of all affected patients and their families. Some threatened lawsuits. Others demanded Casimir's immediate removal. The research program that had offered such hope now teetered on the edge of expelling him. Dr. Bailey advocated for one more chance, proposing an ultra-restrictive protocol. Casimir would be isolated from other patients entirely, receiving only individual therapy. No group activities, no access to common areas, no opportunity to manipulate others. It was barely a step above solitary confinement, but it was better than maximum security. I agreed to the new restrictions, signing documents that acknowledged the severity of Casimir's actions. Each signature felt heavier than the last. My son had progressed from stalking individuals to orchestrating complex schemes affecting dozens. His delusion was evolving, becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. The isolation protocol began immediately. I watched through reinforced glass as staff moved Casimir to a secure wing. He remained calm, almost serene, as if this were simply another phase of his research. When he caught sight of me, he smiled and mouthed words I couldn't understand. The gesture chilled me more than any angry outburst would have. Over the following weeks, I pieced together how Casimir had manipulated the other patients. He'd identified their vulnerabilities through careful observation, offering each exactly what they craved. To the lonely, he provided connection. To the guilty, he offered redemption through contributing to his research. To the confused, he gave purpose. He'd built a miniature cult around his trauma preservation theory. Dr. Bailey implemented new therapeutic approaches designed for highly manipulative patients. Casimir underwent intensive sessions focused on consequences and empathy. They used role-playing exercises where he had to experience scenarios from his victims' perspectives. Initially, he treated these as intellectual puzzles, but gradually cracks appeared in his emotional armor. I visited weekly, always under strict supervision. Casimir's isolation was taking a toll. Without access to other patients' traumas, he'd turned inward, documenting his own experiences in obsessive detail. His room's walls were covered with permitted paper, filled with timestamps and emotional mappings of his daily routines. He was becoming his own research subject. During one visit, Casimir attempted a new manipulation. He claimed to have hidden additional data caches outside the facility, places he'd mailed information before his transfer. He offered to reveal their locations in exchange for reduced restrictions. The staff didn't believe him, but I wondered. My son had proven capable of long-term planning beyond what anyone expected. I hired a private investigator to check locations Casimir might have used. The search revealed nothing, but the possibility haunted me. Somewhere, there might be detailed records of vulnerable people's worst moments, waiting to be discovered. The investigator suggested checking storage units, post office boxes, any place Casimir could have accessed during his few supervised outings. The financial strain intensified. The specialized isolation protocol cost even more than standard treatment. My husband took a second job while I sold family heirlooms. We moved to a smaller house, telling ourselves it was temporary. Friends offered loans we couldn't accept, knowing we might never repay them. 3 months into isolation, Casimir experienced what Dr. Bailey called a narcissistic collapse. Without an audience for his theories, without access to others' trauma, his delusion began eating itself. He started claiming his own memories were contaminated, that he needed to purify his temporal signature. Self-harm risks increased, requiring constant monitoring. I watched my son unravel in a different way than before. The confident manipulator was replaced by someone frantically trying to maintain his delusional framework without external fuel. He began elaborate rituals, touching objects in specific sequences, convinced this would preserve their temporal echoes. The staff documented everything, hoping to find therapeutic entry points. Dr. Bailey proposed a radical intervention. They would allow Casimir limited, supervised interaction with one carefully selected patient, someone trained to resist manipulation. The goal was to see if he could maintain any normal human connection without exploitation. It was risky, but isolation was destroying him in different ways. The selected patient, Marcus, was a former therapist recovering from his own trauma. He understood Casimir's tactics and had volunteered to help. Their first meeting was tense, with Casimir immediately probing for weaknesses. Marcus deflected each attempt, redirecting conversations toward present moment experiences rather than past traumas. I observed these sessions through one-way glass, watching Casimir struggle with someone he couldn't manipulate. Marcus refused to discuss his trauma, instead engaging Casimir about books, music, anything except the past. Casimir grew increasingly frustrated, but also surprisingly engaged. For brief moments, he seemed like a normal young man having a conversation. The breakthrough came during their fourth session. Casimir, exhausted from failed manipulation attempts, actually asked Marcus about his favorite movie. Not for data collection, not to find vulnerability, but out of genuine curiosity. It lasted only minutes before he reverted to probing questions, but Dr. Bailey called it significant progress. I began to see glimmers of the son I'd lost. They were fleeting, often followed by renewed attempts at manipulation, but they existed. During one visit, Casimir asked about our old dog, remembering how she used to steal socks. He didn't try to analyze the memory or assign it temporal significance. He just remembered, smiled sadly, and moved on. The legal complications from the data breach continued. Several families pursued civil actions against the facility. My homeowner's insurance somehow got dragged into the mess, with lawyers arguing about liability for Casimir's actions. I spent countless hours in depositions, describing my son's descent into delusion, accepting responsibility I wasn't sure was mine to bear. One afternoon, while organizing legal documents, I found a letter Casimir had tried to send months earlier. It was addressed to Theron's parents, filled with promises to reconstruct their son's final moments through temporal analysis. The pain in those pages was raw, desperate, hidden beneath pseudo-scientific rambling. He'd never mailed it, perhaps sensing even then that it would cause harm. I decided to visit Theron's parents myself. They lived 2 hours away, in a house that still displayed their son's photos prominently. They welcomed me with surprising warmth, offering tea and cookies as if I weren't the mother of their son's disturbed best friend. We talked about the boys' friendship, their shared dreams, the future that had been stolen. Theron's mother revealed something that stunned me. Casimir had been exhibiting odd behaviors even before the accident. He'd asked Theron to document his daily routines, to record conversations for posterity. Theron had found it quirky but harmless, indulging his friend's eccentricities. The obsession with preservation had preceded the trauma, waiting for a catalyst to transform it into delusion. The visit ended with an unexpected gift. Theron's parents gave me a box of their son's belongings that Casimir had left at their house. Inside were notebooks filled with the boys' collaborative projects, including early sketches of what looked like recording devices. Even then, Casimir had been trying to capture and preserve moments as if he'd always known that time was finite. I brought the box to Dr. Bailey, hoping it might provide therapeutic insights. She studied the materials carefully, noting patterns in Casimir's pre-trauma thinking. The temporal preservation obsession had deep roots, possibly stemming from earlier losses or fears I'd never recognized. Theron's death hadn't created the delusion, but had given it devastating focus and purpose. Armed with this new understanding, Dr. Bailey adjusted Casimir's treatment plan. They began exploring his relationship with impermanence, his fear of things ending or being forgotten. Slowly, carefully, they helped him see that his desperate attempts to preserve trauma were actually preventing him from processing loss. 6 months into the isolation protocol, Casimir made an unexpected request. He wanted to apologize to Lysander, not to access his trauma or collect data, but to acknowledge harm caused. Dr. Bailey was skeptical, but I advocated for allowing it under strict conditions. Lysander would participate via video call, with full support present. The apology session was painful to witness. Casimir struggled to articulate remorse without intellectualizing it. He started several times, falling back into technical language about temporal signatures before catching himself. Finally, he simply said he was sorry for scaring Lysander, for making him feel unsafe. Lysander accepted the apology technology cautiously, then ended the call. It wasn't perfect, but it was human. Casimir sat quietly afterward, processing the interaction without trying to extract data from it. Dr. Bailey noted this as major progress. He was beginning to see people as more than sources of temporal echoes, even if that recognition was fragile and inconsistent. The financial reality forced difficult decisions. We couldn't sustain the specialized treatment indefinitely. Dr. Bailey helped us explore step-down options, facilities that could provide adequate care at lower cost. None were ideal, but bankruptcy wouldn't help Casimir either. How did Marcus know exactly what would work with Casimir? Was it from his own therapy training or something deeper? The way Casimir asked about that movie without trying to analyze it makes me wonder if normal conversations physically hurt him now after living in his delusion so long. We began preparing for another transition, hoping the progress would hold. During what might be our last weeks at the research facility, Casimir surprised everyone. He requested to destroy his hidden notebooks, the ones containing patient data. He wanted to do it himself, with witnesses, as a therapeutic exercise. Dr. Bailey arranged for a controlled burning in the facility's courtyard. I watched my son feed pages into a small fire, his hands shaking. Each notebook represented months of obsessive work, countless violations of others' privacy. He moved mechanically at first, then with increasing emotion. When he reached the final notebook, he hesitated, clutching it tightly. Inside were his theories about Theron, his desperate attempts to reconstruct his friend's final moments. The struggle on his face was profound. This wasn't just destroying data, but releasing his connection to Theron, accepting that his friend was truly gone. Dr. Bailey stood nearby, ready to intervene if needed. I held my breath, watching my son battle his deepest delusion. Finally, with tears streaming down his face, Casimir placed the last notebook in the flames. He watched it burn, his body shaking with suppressed sobs. When nothing remained but ashes, he collapsed to his knees. For the first time since Theron's death, he grieved without trying to preserve or analyze the pain. The weeks that followed showed remarkable changes. Without his accumulated data, Casimir seemed lighter, less driven by compulsion. He still mentioned temporal theories occasionally, but they'd lost their urgent quality. He began participating more genuinely in therapy, exploring emotions without immediately trying to categorize them. Dr. Bailey documented his progress carefully, preparing detailed transfer notes for the next facility. She remained cautiously optimistic, warning that recovery from such deep delusions was rarely linear. There would be setbacks, moments of regression, possibly attempts to rebuild his data collection. But the foundation for healing had been laid. My husband and I toured the step-down facility, a smaller program specializing in long-term recovery. It lacked the research focus, but provided stable, compassionate care. The staff had reviewed Casimir's history, preparing protocols to prevent manipulation while encouraging continued growth. It felt like accepting a compromise, but it was sustainable. The transfer day arrived with mixed emotions. Casimir had spent 8 months at the research facility, longer than any previous placement. He'd arrived as a master manipulator orchestrating complex schemes. He was leaving as someone beginning to choose connection over collection, reality over delusion. Dr. Bailey met with us one final time, providing detailed recommendations for continued care. She emphasized the importance of maintaining boundaries while supporting growth. Casimir would always be intelligent, always be drawn to patterns and preservation. The goal was helping him channel these traits healthily, rather than eliminating them entirely. As we prepared to leave, Casimir asked to speak with Dr. Bailey privately. Through the office window, I watched their conversation. No recording devices, no data extraction, just a patient thanking his doctor. When he emerged, his eyes were red but clear. He nodded to me, ready for the next phase. The drive to the new facility was quiet. Casimir sat in the back, watching landscapes pass without commenting on their temporal significance. Occasionally, he'd start to point something out, then stop himself, choosing silence over analysis. These small victories felt monumental after years of constant documentation. At the new facility, the intake process was familiar, yet different. The staff knew Casimir's history but treated him as an individual, not just a collection of diagnoses. His room was simple but comfortable, with clear rules about what materials were permitted. No electronics, no recording devices, but plenty of books and art supplies. I helped him arrange his few belongings, both of us avoiding discussion of what wasn't there. The thousands of hours of recordings, the elaborate equipment, the notebooks full of others' pain, all gone. What remained was a young man slowly learning to exist in the present moment without trying to capture it. Our goodbye was brief but genuine. Casimir hugged me properly for the first time in years, not analyzing the pressure or duration, but simply embracing. He promised to participate in treatment, to resist the urge to collect others' stories. I believed him, even knowing how difficult that promise would be to keep. The drive home felt different from all the others. Usually, I left facilities with dread, wondering what manipulation Casimir was already planning. This time, I felt cautious hope. He wasn't cured, might never be completely free from his delusions, but he was choosing recovery, one moment at a time. That evening, my husband and I sat together in our smaller house, surrounded by boxes we'd never unpacked. We'd lost so much, our savings, our home, our son as we'd known him, but we'd gained something too, the possibility of a future where Casimir could exist without causing harm, where we could love him without enabling destruction. I thought about Theron's parents, about Lysander and his grandmother, about all the families affected by Casimir's obsession. The damage couldn't be undone, the violations couldn't be erased, but perhaps, with continued treatment and support, my son could find redemption in choosing not to repeat them. The phone rang. Dr. Bailey calling with a final update. Casimir had completed his first day at the new facility without incident. He'd attended group therapy without trying to extract stories, eaten meals without documenting them, interacted with staff appropriately. Small steps, but in the right direction. I hung up and found myself in Casimir's old room, now stripped of its chaos. The walls bore faint marks where he'd hung his temporal maps. The carpet showed wear from his pacing. But it was just a room now, ready to become something new. Like my son, it held potential for transformation. Outside, the world continued its relentless forward motion, creating new moments that would fade into memory. Somewhere, people were experiencing trauma that my son would have once tried to harvest. But tonight, he was simply sleeping in a bed, dreaming dreams he wouldn't try to record, letting time pass without desperate attempts at preservation. The journey ahead remained long and uncertain. There would be setbacks, moments when the old obsessions surfaced. But for the first time since Aaron's death, I believed my son might find a way to live with loss without being consumed by it. He might learn that some things were meant to fade, that impermanence gave life meaning rather than stealing it. I prepared for bed, checking locks out of habit but feeling less afraid. Casimir was contained not by walls but by his own growing awareness. He was choosing, moment by moment, to be present rather than to preserve. It was the most human thing he'd done in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth or regression. But tonight, my son was safe. Others were protected from his obsessions, and healing had begun. It wasn't the future I'd imagined when he was born, but it was a future nonetheless, and that was enough. Phew, that was a ride. Appreciate you being here while I tried to make sense of all the weird, wild stuff we just went through. Plenty to wonder about, that's for sure. Subscribe for more content like this.